we have mistreated completely the great opportunities we got when the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact fell apart. And we said, now we can do whatever we want. We can intervene, we can create Kosovo, we can do wars in Iraq, we can do Afghanistan, we can do this and that. And then you got the victim 9/11, the victim psychology. You have victim psychology is very important. Look at Israel's activities today. Look at 9/11 and Bush. Look at Trump today saying we have been an economic victim all the time. You know, the moment people say victim, you should be very, very careful. There's nothing worse. There's no violence worse than victim violence.
Hello, everybody. This is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and today I'm talking again to Dr. Jan Oberg, a Danish peace researcher in Sweden, who I am sure you all remember from previous episodes on this channel. Dr. Oberg recently wrote a noteworthy Substack article about the ongoing deterioration of peace research in Europe, specifically about the gradual transformation of peace into security, most notoriously exemplified by SIPRI. SIPRI is the so-called Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, which today more or less exclusively works on security and not anymore on the question of peace. What happened? And that's what we want to discuss about today. So, Jan, thank you very much for coming online again.
Well, thank you very much for wanting me once again.
Always, because I mean, this article that you wrote is very telling that SIPRI, which is an important think tank in Europe, it's one of the big ones that gets cited all the time, is now basically only working on security. Can you maybe outline a bit the trajectory of what you've observed over the actually decades that you've been looking at it, and maybe start with how it was formed?
Well, it happens, so happens that when I worked on um, international arms trade in the 70s as a preparation for my PhD, I worked at SIPRI. I learned how they collected data and make, at the time, paper cuttings and put them together and what ended up in the SIPRI yearbook. I also had the great honor of meeting Alva Myrdal, who was the, if you will, mother of invention of SIPRI, with the wish that there should be an institute that uh, got the data the world needed about armament, and that they have been doing very well. And then also, and that's in the statutes, an institute that should come up with ideas about how to solve conflicts peacefully. And that's what they don't do and have not done. So I followed it on and off, of course, made use of SIPRI's, let's say, military expenditure figures because they are good. The most reliable I think we have. But I think it's fair to say that it's no longer peace research. The focus, the framework, the main concepts, etc., is not peace research. And then people might say, well, it says that it's an institute of peace research. So let me define roughly what I think peace research is. There are many approaches to it, but one for me very important is that, like medicine, it is a study of reduction of all kinds of violence. Let's say, if you will, what Johan Galtung would call the negative peace. And then, of course, peace research is about coming up with alternatives, ways, strategies for a better world with less violence, be it gender violence, physical violence, territorial violence, military violence, direct violence, psychological violence, cultural violence. And that's where I think we have seen a trend over the last few years that study, that endeavor, that goal-oriented academic intellectual purpose of reducing violence has disappeared. It's not only SIPRI. It's Johan Galtung's own institute in Oslo. It is lots of peace research institutes at our universities, which of course have become state-financed and therefore very controlled. There are limits to what they can do. My own institute at Lund University in Sweden, where I sit, I was the director of it. It was closed down in 89. The Copenhagen Peace Research Institute, with one of my mentors, led by one of my mentors internationally, through two evaluative processes, the Copenhagen Peace Research Institute, COPRI, under Håkan Wiberg's leadership, was closed down at the time when Anders Fogh Rasmussen was the prime minister and later NATO secretary general. So what I've seen around me is tons of institutes that have either been mainstreamed completely into security, international relations, doctrines, and or being closed down. And I think it goes for the U.S. Institute of Peace. You can go on like that. Peace has been deleted from politics, from the media, and from research. The reason we survive at the Transnational Foundation, of which I'm the co-founder and director, is that we have no we have no state support. We're people financed, and we're all volunteers. That means we can be free. And my final point would be: you don't do peace research without theory. All research is about theory and practical stuff. Now, a peace research that calls itself peace research but does not do theoretical studies, conceptual studies, development, things like nonviolence, peaceful conflict resolution, conflict analysis, reconciliation, forgiveness, the whole, spectrum of theoretical deliberations and concept development is not peace research to me. So, long story short, that's why I'm critical to SIPRI, which we focus on today.
Yes, and you also outlined how the entire the topics that SIPRI is working on have been refocused, right? Not only away from peace research, but toward just understanding implements of war, basically exclusively, and then the application of what these new types of warfare and so on mean, which is basically the opposite of peace research, right?
Yeah, if you change, which they have done also on top of their homepage, a leading source on peace to a leading source on peace and security, and now a leading source on security, and you define security. I'm not against security. There's human security, there's global security, there's security theories. Of course, we need security. That's not my point. My point is that when you do that, and like governments, think that security is first and foremost a matter of weapons, then you are on the wrong track. Then you end up, as the present director and others, supporting NATO, not even seeing NATO as a problem from a peace point of view, and the amassment of weapons in NATO countries, the overspending of NATO countries, and the nuclear doctrine of NATO, but also legitimating the expansion of NATO against all the promises made to Gorbachev, and leading to where we are today. I'm not defending the Russian invasion, but I can explain it without defending it. You end up having a focus, inviting researchers who are either trained in mainstream institutes, in institutions like NATO and the European Union, or happens to have been somewhere at an American institute, either in the US or elsewhere. The new director is will be from the American University in Cairo. And so, the radical alternatives that peace is in a militarist culture are deleted. They are left there. And you cooperate with the Munich Security Conference, which is the most militarist forum anywhere in the world. You have had a former director of it, Jan Eliasson, who has been sitting for, if not hours and many minutes, talking about how it pained his heart to accept NATO, Sweden's entry into NATO, etc., etc. And the rest of very much of what you hear and videos and comments and on the blog of SIPRI is what I would simply call platitudes. Nothing to do with a new thinking, alternatives, conflict resolution, proposals for peaceful solution. Where is the proposal for stopping the genocide, which they haven't touched, by the way, in Palestine? Where is the proposal for a peaceful solution to what is going on in Ukraine? You can't find it at SIPRI, and that's another reason it's not a peace research institute.
How did that happen? As you said, like Alva Myrdal, this great Swedish diplomat, who was mother and one of the founding members of the of SIPRI, who clearly even installed this in the title of the institute, right? From there, from the 70s up until the 2020s, within these 50 years, you had this shift on what this institution works on. And to me, this seems so important because it seems to reflect what is happening in European societies in general. That while we had a peace movement in the 1970s, when we had this idea that peace needs to be created and peace needs to be, also on the streets, be demonstrated for and against nuclear weapons and so on and so forth, all of that was swept away, and it was swept away in a very natural manner. It just left the scene. It's like as if though the actors that were on the stage just at some point got tired of the play and just went away, and now we have an empty stage and still pretend that the play is still going on. And the rhetoric is still the same of we want Europe as a force for good, and a force for security and strength and so on. But the not playing anymore. How did it happen? Because I don't think the SIPRI people consciously tried to undermine their purpose. This is more of something that fizzled out.
I'm not sure what my answer to that very complex long-term question is. I would say it has, of course, to do with, I've said that before and written it in tons of places, when the West is going down, it's becoming weak. And that also means it does not have the strength to have an open debate about alternatives. It coexists very well with, for instance, having no serious debate in Sweden about joining NATO. It coordinates very well with the fact that there is only one narrative in Europe today about Russia, Ukraine, and it deletes completely NATO's expansion and overarmament vis-a-vis Russia. It ties in very well with, as I said, peace having been deleted from the public discourse. In terms of, when did you last hear a journalist ask a prime minister whether the proposal the prime minister makes is good for peace or will lead to peace, or how the prime minister or foreign minister or defense minister defines peace? I see it in Denmark, where you have a bunch of people representing a kakistocracy with a militarist attitude. It's just the more weapons, the better, no matter the price. You have the Europeans now arguing for 800 billion plus euros to be spent on top of what has already been spent in a period in which we're in economic crisis and we're facing two Cold Wars, one with the Trump regime and one with Russia, and to a certain extent with China too. Three, if you will, three Cold Wars. And we're going to waste all the money in Sweden and my children and grandchildren's life on arming, and perhaps the more we arm, the more likely a war. So peace as a concept has been eradicated, deleted, cancelled from politics, from media, and from research. And I think it's because it is so terribly relevant. It is a consistent attempt to show to people that there would be other ways of doing it, but supporting the military industrial media academic complex, MIMAC. Now, if I said, why is nobody talking about the United Nations in these conflict areas anymore? Peacekeeping, it worked very well before. I know a little bit about it from Yugoslavia, for instance. Why do we not talk about civilian conflict resolution? But a solution is like Stoltenberg said when he was NATO Secretary General, that peace comes through weapons. You can go on like that. It's a perversity. It's an Orwellian world we have. It's a world in which narratives and emotionalism and lack of knowledge is a quality and is given priorities. There's so many things we could do. We could have solved the Ukraine conflict long ago with civilian means. And we don't do it because we think arming Ukraine so it can defeat Russia and all these bizarre ideas, perverse ideas. A perverse idea is spending a certain percentage of the gross national product. It has nothing to do with peace. Absolutely nothing to do with peace. And I can say that because nobody's paying me for saying anything particular, but my colleagues at these institutes can't say this anymore.
Yeah, but I wonder if they can say it or if they can think it. it's gone from the way that we conceptualize in Europe the a good society, right? Again, as you said, we don't even try to think about peace, so we don't conceptualize what a peaceful relationship with Russia would look like, right? We
Right.
don't think the thoughts. We manage to drill them out of the brains of many of the people who hold even like important chairs in universities, so that the thoughts don't get
Oh, yes. Oh,
thought
yes.
anymore. Um,
It's become very difficult, as difficult as it was in the Warsaw Pact to criticize armament and bloc policies and all that. It's become equally difficult in NATO countries to have an intelligent discussion about military and civilian ways of handling crisis. I'm not saying we should not talk about military. I'm a co-author of a book about defensive military security and human security way back in the 80s. I worked with military people, I would say almost all my life, and different, particularly UN people. And so what I'm saying is the balance is totally screwed up now. There is nobody talking about peace anymore. What could be done instead of military? The military has dominated armament, rearmament, and all that is totally dominating the public discourse, and that is damn dangerous.
it is
I'm
very
just repeating,
dangerous.
it is damned
It
dangerous.
it's the breeding ground upon creating these self-fulfilling prophecies. But
Yes,
this is something
exactly.
that fascinates me because I don't think it's a conscious process. It is something that's going on over periods of time in societies, and then you crowd out certain ways of thinking about the world, and you replace them with another concept. I mean, and one
Very
of the
true.
things that fascinates me is this neutrality issue. Neutrality used to be extremely well understood. And again, I showed this before. These two books written by two Americans, I mean
Mhm.
collected or
Mhm.
collections about neutrality, published in 1939. The Americans understood neutrality to the T. And then, after the Second World War, the entire US neutrality was replaced with the idea of isolationism. Suddenly, everybody was called an isolationist, not a neutralist. So we didn't just negate the role of neutrality in the 19th and early 20th century. We just stopped talking about it, and there and now have forgotten about it. A lot of it we've forgotten so much, and I
Yes.
wonder if the Europeans with their peace tradition are now doing the same. I mean, just not talking about it anymore and replacing it with new concepts that lend themselves to militarism.
Of course, one factor, Pascal, that you don't know because you're such a young man, but an old man like me can compare back in time. As I said to you, I worked in the 70s as a young student. I was allowed to sit at SIPRI and see how they did their data collection. That's 50 years ago. So, if you ask somebody who comes in today who is 30 with a doctoral dissertation from King's College in London or something like that, they don't have the conceptualization of peace that we had in Europe. They may have read about it, but they have not experienced it themselves. My wife and I knocked on the Berlin Wall New Year's Eve, 89, 90, and thought that we were finally having peace in Europe. These types of experiences, expectations, remembering people like Olof Palme and Willy Brandt and these people who had a thinking and who had a personal experience from war, is something I'm very grateful to be able to cherish and do comparison over time, how things have disintegrated. But if you are a young scholar seeking a career, you probably are happy to sit and get a job at SIPRI or some other institution because, well, it gives you an income, but I wouldn't say that motivates, it would be not so nice to say that that's the only motivation people have. But you come into a research institution culture. This is the way we speak about it here. And this is not the way we speak about it here. And you adapt to that over time. That's why it's called the military industrial media academic complex. And the same applies to editorial offices in the mainstream press and the public media. Because that's the way we talk about it here. We don't talk about it. I mean, you can't see in the Swedish press or in the Swedish research world that NATO expanded and that it could have something to do with Russia's invasion. that it could have been seen as provocative. You have SIPRI also using the word the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Excuse me, this is NATO words. It was not a full-scale invasion. You come to the second line in the introductory statement to one of the projects at SIPRI, and it says things have changed since the reinvasion of Russia into Ukraine. History starts there. To us who are a little bit older and more experienced and know a little bit more, sorry for sounding arrogant, the story didn't begin there. I'm sorry. This is bullshit intellectually and historically. But that's how you write if you are allied with the Munich conference, if you can't be in opposition to or criticize NATO, etc. And that's where we are. I'm sorry, but that's where we are. And that disseminates through, that contaminates the whole thinking among people also. Whether it's ordinary citizens, they believe this whole thing. How should they, who don't spend more than maybe 20 minutes per day on understanding the world through the media, how should they get to any other conceptualization unless they happen to be somebody like you and me who spent a major part of our lives trying to understand the world?
Of course, and the power of discourse is huge, right? And if you hear in propaganda time and again, invasion, 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 unprovoked invasion. I mean, you start using these terms yourself of naturally because that's how everybody frames it. That's how everybody knows it, right? It's how we talk about the Second World War and the Russians talk
Yes.
about the Great Patriotic War, because those are the jargons that you use to refer to them. And historians are usually very aware of the conceptual implications of even everyday kind of framings, but they are fundamental. That's why this question to me is how that process goes. And you already pointed out, that maybe historical memory has something to do with it, or the lack of it. On the other hand, you made a very interesting thesis at the beginning, which is you said it's because the West is declining. Out of weakness, some sort of that out of weakness you have this now growing need for, maybe let's call it epistemic certainty, epistemic security, that we know what to do even though we feel that we're losing control. Could that be something that explains the coming together of this cohort now into this one direction?
I think so. It's even, normal for individual at the individual psychological level. If you feel weak or challenged or something like that, you don't invite a lot of people normally. Some people do. You don't normally invite a lot of people to criticize you and say, hey, why don't you do things differently? And I think that if we go back to or stay with the paradigm of peace research, peace and conflict, and peace and future studies that I started out with, the systematic reduction of violence, it takes a hell of a civil courage nowadays to stand for such a view and say, hey, what about Gandhi? You see what I mean? Could we do it differently? Would it be nice to talk to each other instead of killing each other? We live in a culture now in which that is a controversial question. We live in a culture now in which people are arrested for supporting Palestinians in the genocide, uh, because it could be hurtful emotionally to those who support genocide, which is the whole Western world led by the US and Israel, including the European Union and NATO. So we're living in a perverse world in which the beauty of the West historically was we could have, thanks to democracy, open media, free expression, free research, and all that, we could have an intelligent discussion where our different opinions came in. And through dialogue, we came somehow, maybe I'm beautifying it now, simplifying it, but we somehow arrived at what was right to do. That is over. You only have some elites running a militarist, totally non-democratic. There's no democracy in Sweden about foreign policy. There's no democracy in the United States under the Trump regime. It's a presidential government by decrees. and strange statements like "I want Greenland." I want Greenland. Yeah, I want Greenland. Yeah, you probably gonna get it. If I don't get what I want, I'll use military means. We're quite far out in what you and I would probably associate with the theater of the absurd, Beckett and UNESCO, etc. And peace is the Godot who never comes. The
Mhm.
difference is that nobody talks about Godot as peace or peace as Godot. We're not even expecting peace anymore. We're
The horrible,
expecting
the
some
horrible.
kind of military, not even balanced, because the West is hugely overarmed compared with Russia. It's about 1 to 10 or something like that. Whereas you and I, when we were younger, in the first Cold War in Europe, we always learned that if there was a kind of balance between the Warsaw Pact and NATO, it would be stabilizing. Now you have it completely different. And still, we're arguing now for rearmament, even to even higher levels. This is totally sick. It's insane. It's non-rational, and I can't explain it better than I've done. I'm at my. I mean, there are things that happens in our lives that are very difficult to explain.
Yes, but this is what I would, more than explain it to the Europeans, who I think have to a large extent also lost the ability to understand it. I would now like to explain what's happening to the Russians, the Chinese, the Southeast Asians, the Africans and South Americans, because I hear this from colleagues in Indonesia who ask me, Pascal, what's up? I mean, this makes no sense. I mean, please. And it does make no sense. So what we need to do is to maybe ask for understanding from the rest of the world that Europe is going through maybe what the Chinese went through in the Cultural Revolution, when they gutted and trashed their own historical development in a bizarre 20-year moment of their development, right? That they now came to regret quite a bit, right? And maybe this is the European moment of absolute bizarre ideology, and we need to somehow push through to the other end. I just don't know how, and it's gonna hurt definitely.
It's going to hurt, and I think what is let me say what is the top tragedy of this is it's self-inflicted and self-destructive. There's
Yes.
nobody, Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, Africa, whatever. There's nobody who is out to kill the West, occupy the West, control the West, steer the West. There's nobody who is even contemplating intellectually or morally or emotionally to do that. And there's nobody who is developing weapons to do that. They're basically defending themselves against the West and its expansion and its unipolar adherence to the unipolar past. We have mistreated completely the great opportunities we got when the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact fell apart. And we said, now we can do whatever we want. We can intervene, we can create Kosovo, we can do wars in Iraq, we can do Afghanistan, we can do this and that. And then you got the victim, 9/11, the victim psychology. You have victim psychology is very important. Look at Israel's activities today. Look at 9/11 and Bush. Look at Trump today saying we've been an economic victim all the time. The moment people say victim, you should be very, very careful. There's nothing worse, there's no violence worse than victim violence, particularly fake victim violence. The Americans are not victims of anything, they have victimized the world. I'm not saying they only did bad things. I've never said that, and I don't mean it. But if you look at all these lost wars, the ravaged countries, the millions of people killed, and the economic exploitation, etc., and now we are hearing that the American society and economy has been a victim all the time. So I don't know where we get from here, but I think it has to fall apart. And there has to be something more dramatic. I'm not saying necessarily war, but let's say deep economic crisis, complete failure, uh, what Doris Lessing calls shikasta, a deep failure in the system that will make the West say, oops, we got to rethink things to stay a partner in the world. Because otherwise, the West in 20, 40 years from now will be a third world region compared with the booming rest of the world. I'm very optimistic and very positive and very fascinated. I hope I live long enough to see that multipolar world develop in which the West has also come to its senses. I don't want anything else. But I'm not sure that with the present kakistocratic leadership that we will be able to make a U-turn and come back to some decency and leave militarism behind, because that is self-destructive. And I say it with pain in my heart. I've never been anti-Western, anti-American, blah, blah, blah. But it is very sad that we cannot point fingers at anybody else. That's, of course, we project our own on Russia and say Russia is going to come and take all of us. When it has taken, Ukraine, it'll continue the rest of Europe. And 48 hours, Russians and Putin will stand at the Eiffel Tower in Paris. I mean, give me a break. It's a fantasy world. And that is dangerous in security. Security studies, war studies, peace studies must be the highest quality level of realism
But
without being realpolitik, but realism.
I mean, a lot of the charge also of like some people roll their eyes at peace studies or the word peace because they say it's unrealistic. Just look at the warmongering of Vladimir Putin, right? That's why we need all of these weapons. Without weapons, we would all be Russians already. And I had these discussions in the International Institute for Peace of somebody who asked me, uh, uh, if push comes to shove, would you rather be uh, would you rather be a dead Swiss or a living Russian? And that's a dumb framing. That's just an inherently dumb framing. And I told her, and if push came to shove, I'd rather be a living Russian, actually. But that's just, if you create such a stupid binary, you are already excluding the the option of cooperation and stability. And that mental framework is now all prevalent all over Europe. Um,
Well, of course, culturally, you're pointing us to something very deep. It has always been a binary or dichotomizing culture in the Western world: the good guys, the bad guys, the men oriented, the women oriented, the left wing, the right wing, us, the good guys, them, the not so good guys. I mean, those who are saved and those who still need to be saved by mission and all that. I mean, Christianity has a lot to do with the things we're talking about today. Western deep culture, deep ways of thinking has very much to do with it. So if we're the good guys, the Russian, and the Chinese must be the bad guys. The idea that they could be gray nuances and there are pluses and pros and cons in all cultures, and we could maybe find a way to cooperate with the best on all systems. That's where Gandhian thinking is so superior, because Gandhi said, I don't buy one ideology or one religion. I take the best of each system and thinking and put it together in my own thinking. That is called eclecticism. The West is unable to do eclecticism. China works because it does and has done since you said it and mentioned the Cultural Revolution. They have done this. Probably they already had it somewhere, but it became very, strange at the Cultural Revolution. But they have said, well, why can't we have communism and capitalism at the same time? Why can't we have one party and a democracy in the whole society? And why can't we? And then they said, let's try to combine it. I mean, the Chinese are masters in eclecticism, and that's why it works
this
compared
is
to the West, which is a master of useless dichotomies,
and
unrealistic.
and dogmatism. Europeans are
And dogmatism.
masters at creating frameworks and theories and then demanding that we stick to them to a T and that everything needs to fit in there. And if it doesn't, it basically disproves the theory, and that's just dumb. It just takes away the option of an eclectic worldview, which is what you need, and accepting that there are not only difference but contradictions. And I see that, for instance, with the discussion in the US and Europe about Taiwan. Taiwan needs to be either part of China or independent. It's this dumb dichotomy, not realizing that Taiwan for the past 50 years has been both at different levels. And mainland China is the biggest trading partner of Taiwan, which is still calls itself the Republic of China, and they have passports with which they can travel anywhere that they want. It works. It works. It's neither of the two, and it's working. And it's the negation that this is the case, which fascinates me.
Absolutely. No, I agree with you, but we've seen it again and again. This dichotomizing, which I believe comes from Christian thinking.
Mm.
You're either with us or you're against us, you know that. And if you're against us, we know how to make you with the Bible or with the sword coming to be with us. That has always been, you take 9/11, you take terrorism, we have done nothing wrong. It's all the others who are bad guys, no self-reflection. And you know, if for decades you live without self-reflection, you're going to go wrong. The West lives in a kind of groupthink bubble at the moment, and one day it'll make a decision which will go madly wrong, probably masterminded by Trump. I don't know if he has not already done so, and that will be the wake up.
But
That
we
will
did
be
it
the wake up
already
for the world.
twice, Jan. We did it already twice, and we didn't learn from
We
it. I
did
mean,
what
we had a
twice?
First World
Sorry.
War. We had the First World War where we militarized ourselves, the European continent, into a mass slaughter, which, by virtue of also being the colonizer of the rest of the world, dragged everybody else in against their will because they had nothing to say about it. And in the Second World War, we just managed to expand it, that warfare to everybody else, right? And still, and through the Cold War and the division of the European continent, we went through all of that just in order to arrive in 2025 and again blame everybody else but ourselves for the militarization that we ourselves are now engaged in.
Well, if you ask me, I think the only thing we learn from history is that we don't learn anything from history.
Yeah.
Also, because history is always very subjective. How do we interpret this and that according to the winner? So, and I must say, in a slight disagreement, I am not sure that the present situation of the Western world is not of such a kind that there is not much guidance to fetch in historical studies. I mean, if you ask me about Ukraine and the terrible things that happened there, of course, you need 15 years, 10, 15 years of history to know where it started. And it didn't start with the invasion, as we both know. But if we say we have a First World War and we have a Second World War and we have had a Cold War, etc., you know, if you look at how decision makers are acting today and talking today and thinking today, if they do, there's no evidence that history, whatever, however you interpret it, has any impact on these people. I don't know whether they read history books, etc. But my point has always been that we are also, as a culture, far too much engaged in history, relatively speaking. You cannot solve a conflict if you only look at history and who did what to whom. To solve a conflict, you have to look into potential futures. You have to devise ideas about how could these fighting parties live peacefully with each other in the future. I would love to have a paradigmatic change where we would balance history knowledge and future knowledge. And there is something called future knowledge. That is our assumptions about what the world will be like if we do this and that. You can't have a doctor who only looks at history. Well, you smoked too much and you got cancer. No. How can you live in the future and survive after an operation or surgery? You cannot solve Ukraine without proposing ideas for Ukraine's role, structure, relations, organization, vis-a-vis Russia, vis-a-vis Europe. I mean, if we could at least spend 10% of our energies talking about potential futures instead of talking about victimization and who did what wrong to whom, etc., we're not going to solve these problems. Problem solving is about what can we do in the future? How will the future be better? If we have little peace studies, we have even less future studies, which is an academic discipline like peace. And so I'm sure I've quoted this before in your wonderful program. I always quote George Bernard Shaw that most people look at the world as it is and ask why. What we should do is to look at the world as it could be and ask why not. Of course, we could learn. We could come down from the trees and we could learn to handle our conflicts. There will always be conflicts in the world. Well, we must reduce this violence. And SIPRI and all the others, knowingly or not, intentionally or not, they're doing the wrong thing because they don't see. They even use the word conflict prevention. And then I know people don't understand a thing. We should not create conflict prevention. We should not prevent conflict. We should enjoy our conflicts and our differences. That makes society rich and diverse. What we should reduce is the use of all types of violence to get our way, and instead dialogue and listen to people. That's what conflict resolution is about. It's not, I mean, conflict prevention is a bizarre, absurd, and nonsensical term. Period.
I absolutely agree with you. I absolutely agree. The first book I ever worked on in German was called uh, um, Daring Conflicts, Reducing Violence. So actually, we need to have good
Great.
we need to have
Excellent.
ways of engaging with conflict. And actually, all of the the mechanisms that we are working on in international relations that are related, constructively related to reducing or getting rid of war, are alternative means of doing conflicts, right? International law. The whole approach of using law and using courts and creating mechanisms and human rights courts and even international humanitarian law, which is basically the regulation of war, which is bizarre, but it's the taming of the beast, right? If you can't get rid of the beast, at least make
Yeah,
it a little
yeah,
bit
yeah,
less
yeah.
less bloody. All of this has to do with more constructive approaches towards conflict. And I completely agree that we that the in order to resolve violence, we need to think of non-violent way of engagement. Um, how would you, if you were King Donald, what would you do?
I never thought that
Where would
thought.
you tweak the system? Like, I mean, I think it dawned on me recently, that really the president of the United States is probably still the one of the most powerful people on earth. There's just few people who where in one single individual you have so many powers concentrated, political powers. Maybe Xi Jinping has similar powers. I'm not sure. Maybe Vladimir Putin. I'm not sure. But the U.S. president, if with that power you could tweak something in the system in order to push the system to do what SIPRI should do, to do more peace research and peace thinking and so on, where would you re-regulate something?
Well, if you talk about research, I would, of course, provide money for the study that I call peace research, peace and future studies, nonviolent study how non-military means can be more effective, which there are studies of in solving conflicts than weapons-based ways of doing it can be. I would, of course, try to, what do you call it, reinstall the word peace as something we can say without being considered naive. And it would only take a few leaders to hammer home that point, and then people would begin to think.
I
Now,
mean,
Trump does say peace sometimes, but he doesn't mean it. He means resources. He's interested in the resources of Greenland, of Ukraine, and outside Gaza, etc. But if you had leaders somewhere, I'm not saying all change should come from leaders, but it either has to come from leaders and decision makers, or it has to come from huge nonviolent popular movements, people who assert their demand for peace. They're not, I mean, everything we're talking about in this event here is financed by taxpayers' money. Now, I would love to see tax strike. People who said, I put my tax money for the military, that part that goes, whether it's 2%, 5%, or whatever it is, into the military, I put into a national foundation or fund, and it'll be released the day my government does something sensible.
mhm.
Tax refusal or whatever for the military in this. Soldiers not turning up, people choosing other opportunities than being seduced by being able to get a driving license when they join the military and education and all that. I mean, there are thousands of ways you could think of that change, but at the moment, the situation has not gotten bad enough for people to begin to think of the madness that they see in front of their eyes. And I repeat, that madness is not to be ignored. It is very dangerous.
I'm thinking of like how we could approach approach this on a political level, because it's true. I mean, if we had grassroots movements and grassroots activism, then that can change things. We've seen it with the Vietnam War. It does change the course of
Well, you
political
saw it in
developments today.
Europe in the
But
80s,
on the Europe,
priests and the Green parties and all that.
but like,
Authors,
think of something
intellectuals.
like in Europe, but also in the United States, if we just had a legislation that would forbid using weapons outside of your own territory. It's like only within your own
Yes,
territory you're allowed to use weapons. Outside, no. How that would
defensive defense.
instantaneously change the entire dynamic, and it would be very heavy-handed, but
Both
well,
Johan Galtung and several others, and military people and myself, did writings, book chapters or whole books about defensive defense. The kind of thing that can never threaten somebody else unless they come to your territory.
yeah.
Chinese wall. But, I've been teaching military academies in the 80s. Even in NATO, I was invited to talk about defensive defense. When I'd given 2 lectures there, I was told that I was no longer wanted. You guess why? You had these young people being trained in NATO's college, and they came up to me and almost embraced me and said, "Thank you very much. We're on the same line. We want peace." That's not what NATO wanted. So I had 2 guest lectures, and I was not invited anymore.
Yeah, but this is
I can live with that, but they can't.
it's the militarists. This is how you recognize the militarists, right? They will use the all of the defense language, but they will use it for offensive purposes and still
Exactly.
claim self-defense in the name of victimhood, as you correctly pointed out.
A SIPRI director who does not see any problems in military deterrence and nuclear weapons in NATO, and who does not see the difference between offensive and defensive deterrence, is not a very good peace researcher.
Mhm. And we have too many of those at the moment, or like it's captured. The discourse is completely captured. I'm outside of a couple of forums like this one and others where we can think freely, but oh well.
Well, that will change. That will change. Don't underestimate what you do yourself. There are many more people reading or following your channel than there is following local newspapers in Sweden.
I'm glad
I
about
mean,
that.
dangerous man.
No, I
But you
mean,
see
I'm
what I
even
mean?
proud.
Look at the figures on YouTube. Look at the figures on Substack. Look at where the real discussion about our future is going on. It's going on everywhere else, but in the national governments and the national public service media and in the mainstream institutes. They're totally irrelevant today. I'm sorry. SIPRI has, apart from its good bean counting, it's totally irrelevant for the future of the world.
Yeah. We just need to translate it also into political meaning. Because I don't want a revolution. I don't like revolutions because they always kill a lot
Non-violent
of
ones are
people.
good.
Hmm?
Non-violent revolutions are good.
Yeah, but they give me an example of a non-violent revolution.
Well, Gandhi did it well.
True. Um,
Martin Luther King did it very well.
true. If we take those as
It,
yeah.
it's those people who said, don't, I mean, I would even say Dr. Rugova in Kosovo before it was taken over by the UCK, the Kosovo Liberation Army, and CIA and the German Bundesnachrichtendienst.
Mm.
There was so much more strength and achievement in not violently struggling for what you want to achieve. I'm not saying everybody can do it, but I'm saying we who are already on top of the world, so to speak, economically, in terms of resources, welfare, and all that, we could easily change to a system with much less weaponry and militarism and say we're become civilized, we talk when we have problems. That may be very difficult for Palestinians or for people in South Africa at the time, or for the underprivileged in the United States society, where I, by the way, would not exclude a kind of civil war situation. But we who are already privileged could begin to think and take a moral leadership and saying it is part of, like we have gotten rid of slavery, absolute monarchy, child labor in principle, at least. We have condemned certain ways of acting and certain beliefs. We are also now condemning the idea of creating security by means of weapons only. We could do that. Come on, we could do that.
Yeah, we need we need to break through the wall, though. That's
Yeah.
the thing. And it's not a brick wall, right? It's again this created way of thinking. So in a sense, I would like to activate these neurons in people that enables them to think these thoughts correctly. Because if we have this discussion with somebody who's not already on our wavelength, then we need to start building from like a very, very low level. And really, sometimes you see how people's eyes get glazy. It's like, no, but Putin is evil. And it's like, oh no, I'm back to zero.
And then you have said
Let's
everything of importance. Yes.
yeah, okay. Look, I really very much appreciate this because it's important that we think of non-violent futures, and you're one of the people who does that best. And anyone who wants to follow you
Thank
should
you. Thank
subscribe to
you.
your Substack, right?
Absolutely. I would also say, if I may, at the end, the reason peace research is dangerous is that it sometimes have shown to have better ideas. Politicians are not interested or feeling threatened by criticism. They criticize each other, they're criticized by the people, etc. But if somebody comes up and says, hey, why don't you do it differently? Here's a plan. I have some ideas that you've never talked about. It could solve the problem. Then you're dangerous. You're very dangerous to these people. And I used to say to anybody who asked me, I would say, if you study these things for 3 months, intensely, seriously, read some good books, you will know more than the average of decision makers. It's not that difficult. So I'm totally hopeful. I'm just seeing that we need perhaps to get into an even worse situation before people wake up, and that's what you're waiting for.
I don't want that. I want it to get better now.
No,
Um,
I want it, yes, but my prediction is it may be difficult before something worse happens.
I know, I know. I share that assessment, but I don't want it. Jan, thank you very
True,
much for your
true.
time today.
My pleasure. Thanks for your time, and thanks for doing what you do for peace. You are a peace channel.
For peace, for peace and rationality. Thank you, Jan.
Thank you.